Good. Let's look at some examples of completing the square. So in brief, just completing the square basically allows us to change an equation that is a quadratic equation that is in standard form into vertex form. And why do we do that? Because once the equation is in vertex form, we can figure out, well, the vertex of the quadratic equation, but that also allows us to figure out the maximum or minimum value of this equation. Okay, so let's look at some examples here, and let's look at this one. Y equals x squared plus 12x minus 7. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we consider the first two terms of the quadratic equation that is in standard form, and we try to factor out the leading coefficient. In this case, the coefficient that is in front of x squared happens to be 1. So we factor out 1 out of each of these two. Now I know what you're thinking, well, there's nothing, you end up with the same, but for now I think as an introduction it's good to keep that in mind. So let's factor out the 1, so we end up with this. I'm not going to write the 1. Okay, fine, I'll write it just for now. So we factor out 1, we end up with x squared plus 12x close bracket and the minus 7. Good. So now what we need to do, the next step is that we need to take this expression that is in brackets and turn it into a perfect square trinomial. So we do the following. So we so we write equal sign, open brackets, so we write x squared plus 12x, and for now just leave some space because we're going to write something there, close bracket, bring down the negative 7. Now you may have seen some other videos on this, and I've noticed they do it differently. This is the way I do it, and I'm going to show you. Okay, so we leave some space here. What we're going to do is the following. You take the 12 and we're going to divide it by 2. So you divide it by 2 and we get 6. Okay, so we get 6. So we divide by 2 and then we square that result. So now we're going to square this result. And what is 6 squared going to be equal to? It's going to be equal to 36. So we write here plus 36 minus 36. Close brackets, negative 7, right? Okay, so now why do we write plus 36 and negative 36? Because if we just leave the plus 36 there, it would not be equal to the original equation. So we need to leave this minus 36 here. So next we're going to take these three terms and we're going to factor them, because now these three terms are a perfect square trinomial. So the next thing we do is the following. We write this, in fact, and now we're going to use the square brackets because we want to keep track of our variables, since we're not going to be factoring out the negative 36 together with this. So we take these three terms and we write x plus 6 squared, right? So these three are a perfect square trinomial, and this is what we end up with when we factor them. Now we bring the minus 36 that was there, and we close the square brackets in the minus 7. Okay, and then lastly what we need to do is, of course, we need to get rid of the square brackets, and we do the following. We write x plus 6 squared and then minus 36 minus 7. That is going to give us minus 43. So we write x plus 6 squared minus 43. So what we've done, I'm going to move the paper now a little bit. What we've done is the following. Now first we know what the vertex of this equation is. So we know that the vertex is minus 6 comma minus 43. And if the question had asked us to find the maximum or minimum value, well, in this case we know we're going to have a minimum value because the leading coefficient a here happens to be 1. So we know that it opens upwards. And so let's do a rough sketch here. let's do a rough sketch. So what we have is the following, okay, not to scale. We know it's minus 6 minus 43, so that's going to be, this is minus 43, and minus 6 there, okay, and we know that that is going to be the vertex of this equation, right? And we know that in this case the minimum value, it's at negative 43. Okay, let's look at another example. And we have y equals negative x squared minus 4x plus 1. Okay, so now what we have is, well, the leading coefficient in this case happens to be minus 2. So we follow the same process. First, we consider the first two terms, and we need to factor out the negative 2 out of these terms, okay, the coefficient in front of x squared. So we need to factor out the coefficient in front of x squared, so in this case it happens to be negative 2, so let's factor out the negative 2. I know you may be saying that there's an x on each of these, then that's also a common factor, but these are the steps that we normally do for completing the square. So let's just factor out the coefficient. So negative 2, open bracket, this becomes x squared, negative positive 2x, close brackets, plus 1. Alright, the next thing that we need to do is we need to take this expression that is in the brackets and we need to turn it into a perfect square trinomial. So let's do the following. Negative 2, open bracket, x squared plus 2x. Let's leave some space there. I'm going to close the bracket and write the plus 1, just so that we don't forget. The next thing that we do is the following. As I said before, we take this expression divided by 2. By the way, you don't need to show this all the time. So divided by 2. 2 divided by 2 gives you 1, and then we square that result. So always divide by 2 and then square that result. So in this case, we square 1, we're going to end up with plus 1, and then we write minus 1. Good. The next thing that we need to do is we need to factor out these three terms, because now these three terms are a perfect square trinomial. So let's do that right now. And we end up with negative 2. And now I'm going to use the square brackets, open square brackets, open parentheses, x plus 1 squared, and then we bring out the minus 1 here, close the square brackets, write plus 1. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is start bringing in the negative 2, right? And so we need to multiply it by each of these terms. So negative 2 times this expression is going to give us negative 2 x plus 1 squared. Negative times negative positive, 2 times 1, 2, plus 1. And now let's simplify this expression. So negative 2 x plus 1 squared plus 2 plus 1 gives us plus 3. So our vertex for this equation is negative 1, 3. And our, in this case, we have, because the leading coefficient is negative, so we have a maximum value. So our maximum value, it's equal to 3. And of course, if you want to do a rough sketch, oops, let me move this up. If you want to do a rough sketch, you basically, right, we know that it's going to be negative 1, 3, right, and it's going to be opening downwards because the a value is negative, and we know that the maximum value here is going to be 3. We know that the coordinates of that are negative 1, 3. Okay, and that's all.